The September sky over Ashford Plantation turned the color of fresh bruises in the hour before the storm broke. Virginia's autumn heat pressed down like a hand over a mouth, suffocating, insistent, threatening. 23-year-old Elias wiped sweat from his brow as he repaired the stable fence, his calloused hands working the hammer with practiced efficiency despite the approaching thunder that rumbled like a warning from some distant god. He didn't hear her approach until the mare's hooves pounded against earth, desperate and panicked. The horse, Midnight, Master Ashford's prized Arabian, burst into the stable yard, with Mrs. Catherine Ashford clinging to the saddle, her face white with terror, her riding habit torn at the shoulder. The mare's eyes rolled wild, foam flecking her mouth. Something had spooked her badly. Behind them, lightning split the darkening sky, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Elias moved without thinking. Years of working with horses guided his body as he dropped the hammer and stepped directly into the mare's path. Dangerous, foolish. But the alternative was watching Mrs. Ashford thrown against the stable wall, her neck snapping like kindling. He raised his hands, voice low and steady, the voice his mother had taught him before she was sold south, the voice that could gentle any creature. Easy now, easy. Midnight reared once, hooves striking air inches from his face. Catherine Ashford screamed, but Elias held his ground, hands outstretched, speaking words in a language older than English, African words his grandmother had passed down, words that spoke of safety and peace and home. The mare's hooves came down, her head lowered, and then, impossibly, she stepped forward and pressed her trembling nose against Elias's chest. He caught the bridle with one hand and reached up with the other to help Mrs. Ashford down. Their hands touched, hers soft, pale, shaking, his rough, dark, steady. For 3 seconds that stretched like hours, their eyes met. Hers were gray as winter sky, wide with shock and something else. Something that made his stomach drop with fear far deeper than any horse could inspire. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved my life." Elias released her hand as if burned and stepped back, eyes dropping to the mud-churned ground where they belonged. "Just doing my duty, ma'am." But as he led Midnight into the stable, he could feel her gaze following him like heat from a forge, and he knew with the certainty that had kept him alive for 23 years in bondage that everything had just changed in ways that could get him killed. 6 months earlier, Catherine Ashford had arrived at the Virginia plantation as a bride of 18, her trunks filled with books from her father's Boston library and watercolors of a world she would never see again. She'd been raised by a father who'd made his fortune in shipping and lost it to bad investments and worse gambling. Marriage to Thomas Ashford, 37, widowed, wealthy, had been her father's last desperate play to salvage anything from his ruin. "You'll have everything a woman could want," her father had promised, counting the money from her bride price. Servants, status, security. He hadn't mentioned that she'd be property herself, just with better quarters. Thomas Ashford was not cruel by the standards of his class, which meant he only struck her when drunk, only locked her in her room when she disagreed with him publicly, only reminded her daily that she existed at his pleasure and could be discarded at his will. He collected her like he collected his horses. Beautiful, expensive, meant to be displayed but never truly known. The first time she'd seen the whipping post in the slave quarters, she'd vomited into the rose bushes. Thomas had laughed. "You'll grow accustomed to it, my dear. They require discipline. It's the natural order of things." But she hadn't grown accustomed. She'd simply learned to look away. Until today. Until a young man had stepped in front of a panicked horse to save her life, risking his own without hesitation. Until she'd looked into his eyes and seen not the subservience she'd been taught to expect, but intelligence, dignity, humanity that refused to be diminished despite everything that had been done to crush it. Now, standing in her room as her lady's maid, a silent girl named Ruth who'd learned early that speaking meant punishment, helped her out of her torn riding habit. Catherine touched her hand where his had been. Her skin still remembered the warmth, the strength, the shock of connection she'd never felt even on her wedding night when Thomas had claimed her body with the enthusiasm one might bring to a business transaction. "I'm not supposed to feel this," she whispered to her reflection in the mirror. But she did, and denying it would be as futile as denying the storm that now lashed the plantation with rain like nails driven by God's angry hand. Elias's mother, Rebecca, had taught him 3 rules before they sold her away when he was 8. Keep your head down, keep your thoughts hidden, keep yourself alive long enough to see freedom, even if that freedom is only in the next world. He'd followed those rules with the discipline of a soldier. He worked hard, or not so hard. He made other slaves look bad. He spoke little but listened to everything. He'd taught himself to read using newspapers he found lining chicken coops, memorizing words by lamplight while others slept, destroying the evidence before dawn. Knowledge was dangerous. A slave who could read might start thinking about things like bills of sale, property deeds, freedom papers. But what was more dangerous than knowledge? Hope. And when Mrs. Catherine Ashford had looked at him today, really looked at him, not through him the way white folks usually did, something small and terrible and beautiful had stirred in his chest. Hope. That maybe he was more than the price marked in Master Ashford's ledger. That maybe there existed in this world a single person who might see him as human. Stupid. Deadly. The kind of thinking that got men killed slow. Now, as rain drummed on the stable roof, Elias rubbed down Midnight with methodical care, checking her legs for injury, speaking soft words that gentled her, shaking. The mare had been spooked by a snake. He'd found the shed skin near the trail. Nothing supernatural. Everything in this world had an explanation, even the seemingly impossible. "Talking to horses again, boy?" Elias froze. Overseer Pike stood in the stable door, rain dripping from his wide-brimmed hat, whip coiled at his belt like a sleeping snake. Pike was thin and mean as a cornered rat, with eyes that found guilt in innocence and pleasure in pain. "Yes, sir. Just settling her down, sir. Saw you with the mistress." Pike moved closer, boots squelching in the hay-strewn floor. "Saw you touch her." Elias's heart hammered. "She was falling, sir. Would have been hurt bad. I know what I saw." Pike's hand drifted to the whip. "Master Ashford know you got your hands on his property?" The word hung in the air. Property. It could mean the horse. It could mean the woman. Both belonged to Master Ashford equally in the eyes of Virginia law. "Save the horse, sir. That's all." Elias kept his voice flat, empty of anything that could be construed as challenge. "Worth $2,000, that mare. Master wouldn't want her damaged." Pike's eyes narrowed, calculating. The horse was worth more than 10 slaves. Letting her throw the mistress into a wall would have been expensive. Finally, he spat in the hay and turned away. "Keep your distance from the mistress. Next time you touch her, I'll take your hands." When Pike's footsteps faded, Elias released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. His hands shook as he finished with Midnight. He'd been a fool. 3 seconds of eye contact, and already the overseer was watching. Already the scaffolding of his careful survival was cracking. He should avoid Mrs. Ashford like poison. Should never look at her again. Should bury whatever that moment had been in the same grave where he'd buried thoughts of his mother. His sister sold to Texas, the girl he'd loved once before Master Ashford traded her for a new plow. But that night, lying on his pallet in the quarters he shared with 5 other men, Elias couldn't stop seeing gray eyes, couldn't stop feeling the ghost of her hand in his, couldn't stop the hope that whispered, maybe, just maybe, there was something in this world besides survival. And hope, he knew, was the most dangerous thing a slave could carry. Thomas Ashford stood on his veranda, brandy in hand, surveying his empire with the satisfaction of a man who'd built something out of inheritance and ruthlessness. 3,000 acres, 147 slaves. Crops that would bring $30,000 this harvest. Political connections that whispered of a Senate seat in his future. Everything a man could want, including a wife beautiful enough to make other men envious. But Catherine had been difficult lately. Too many questions about the slaves, too much time with those damned books, too many nights when she turned from him in their bed, claiming headaches and women's complaints. She needed discipline, reminding of her place. "Mr. Pike reports an incident today," he said when Catherine joined him for dinner, her hair still damp from the bath, a high-necked dress concealing the bruise on her shoulder from the fall. "Something about your horse and one of the stable hands." Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. Midnight was spooked by a snake. The slave, Elias, kept her from bolting into the wall. "I'm grateful. The horse could have been seriously injured." "The horse," Thomas repeated, watching her face carefully. "Not you." "Both of us, I suppose." Her voice was steady, but her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. "It was nothing, Thomas. He did his duty." Thomas swirled his brandy, letting silence stretch until she shifted uncomfortably. This was an art he'd perfected, using quiet as a weapon, making people fill empty space with confessions. But Catherine, for once, said nothing more, simply cut her meat with precise movements, jaw tight. "That particular slave," Thomas said finally, "is valuable, strong, smart. Too smart, perhaps. I've been considering selling him." Catherine's knife clattered against her plate. "Selling him? But why?" "You just said he was valuable." "Precisely because he's valuable. And because smart slaves are dangerous slaves. They get ideas. They forget their place." He leaned forward. "You understand, my dear, the natural order of things here? The hierarchy that keeps us safe? I understand you think human beings are livestock," Catherine said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke from gunpowder. Thomas set down his glass with great deliberation, rose from his chair, walked slowly around the table until he stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, gentle, almost loving. Then his fingers tightened until she gasped. "You will remember," he said softly, "that you too exist within that hierarchy, that your comfort, your safety, your very existence here depends upon my goodwill and your obedience. You will remember that every slave on this plantation watches to see how you behave. If you show them weakness, sympathy, familiarity, anything that suggests equality, you endanger us all. Do you understand?" "Yes." The word was strangled, forced through pain. "Yes, what?" "Yes, Thomas, I understand." He released her shoulder, returned to his seat, smiled as if nothing had happened. "Good. Now, about the Mitchells' dinner party next week." But as Catherine nodded and murmured appropriate responses, she made a decision. She would not be another thing Thomas Ashford owned and controlled. She would find a way, some way, to claim back pieces of herself. And perhaps that would begin with understanding the man who'd looked at her today as if she mattered beyond her beauty and her bloodline. The man her husband was already planning to destroy, simply for being noticed. It began innocently enough, or at least with the appearance of innocence, which was all that mattered in a world built on careful performances. 3 days after the incident with Midnight, Catherine requested that the garden be redesigned. She wanted climbing roses, a small fountain, new herbs for the kitchen, work that would require daily consultation with someone knowledgeable about plants and construction. Thomas, distracted by business in Richmond, approved the project without much attention. Ruth, the lady's maid, delivered Catherine's instructions to the slave quarters. The garden work was assigned to Elias, whose carpentry skills and way with growing things had been noted by the plantation manager. Their first meeting was formal, awkward. Catherine stood in the morning sun, sketches spread on a table, while Elias stood 10 feet away, hat in hand, eyes properly downcast. But when she asked his opinion on the roses, he forgot for a moment to stay silent. "Climbing roses take 3 years to establish proper, ma'am, and they need support. Trellises, strong ones, not these thin strips." He gestured to her drawing, then remembered himself and dropped his hand. "Begging your pardon, ma'am. Just saying what I know." "No." Catherine's voice was firm. "Don't apologize for knowledge. What would you suggest?" And so it began. Tentative exchanges about soil composition and sunlight angles that gradually, over days, evolved into conversations about other things. She asked how he'd learned about plants. He explained carefully about his grandmother, a woman who'd brought seeds from Africa in her hair when they stole her across the ocean. Seeds that had grown into medicine, into food, into memories of home. "She taught you more than gardening," Catherine observed on the 5th day, when Elias was installing the fountain base. She'd noticed how he calculated angles and measurements without writing anything down, how he spoke with precision that suggested education. "She taught me to see patterns, ma'am, how things fit together, how one thing connects to another." "Can you read?" The question dropped between them like a stone into still water. Elias's hands stilled on the stonework. One wrong answer could mean his hands taken, or worse. "Some, ma'am. The truth, but minimal. Enough to be useful with labels and such." Catherine looked around. No overseer, no house slaves within earshot. She leaned closer, voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I have books. In my room, locked away from my husband. Philosophy, poetry, history. Would you—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Would you like to borrow one?" "Ma'am, that's—" Elias straightened, fear sharp in his eyes. "That's dangerous. For both of us." "Everything worth doing seems to be dangerous," Catherine said. There was something in her voice, loneliness, defiance, desperate need for connection, that made him look at her directly for the first time since the horse incident. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why risk it?" "Because I'm suffocating," she whispered. "Because my husband treats me like a doll on a shelf. Because you're the first person in 6 months who's spoken to me as if my thoughts matter. Because—" She stopped, unable to articulate the rest. "Because when I'm near you, I remember I'm alive." Elias should have refused, should have walked away, should have reported her strange behavior to Master Ashford, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded once, quick and small. "Tomorrow night, leave it under the magnolia tree by the south gate. I'll return it within 2 days." "What would you like?" "Anything," Elias said, and the hunger in his voice wasn't for food. "Anything that reminds me there's a world beyond this one." The book Catherine chose was Wordsworth's Poems. She wrapped it in oilcloth, tucked it under the magnolia tree at midnight, then lay awake until dawn, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But 2 nights later, the book was back with a small paper folded inside. "Thank you for the window. I wandered lonely as a cloud, but tonight I walked through fields of gold." The words were careful, the handwriting precise. He'd not only read the poems, he'd understood them, responded to them, transformed them into something personal. Catherine pressed the note to her chest and wept. Not from sadness, but from the relief of being seen, truly seen. Not as ornament or obligation, but as a person capable of offering something that mattered. The next day in the garden, she waited until Ruth had gone to the kitchen for lemonade. Then she spoke quickly, quietly. "I need to tell you something. The real reason I'm doing this." Elias continued working the soil around new rose bushes, but his shoulders tensed. "Ma'am, maybe some things are better not said." "I'm trapped," Catherine continued as if he hadn't spoken. "My husband owns me almost as completely as he owns you. I have no money of my own, no family who would take me in. My father sold me to settle his debts. If I try to leave, Thomas can legally drag me back, force me to submit, lock me away until I comply. Her voice broke. We're both prisoners here, Elias, just with different chains. It's not the same, he started. I know, she cut him off. I know it's not the same. You can be sold, beaten, killed without consequence. My cage is gilded, but Elias, I've watched what happens here. I've seen the whipping post. I've heard the screams, and I've stood silent because I was taught that speaking up would change nothing. But when you saved me, when you looked at me like I was worth saving, something changed. Mrs. Ashford, Catherine, please, when we're alone, call me Catherine. The request was absurd, dangerous, a violation of every social boundary that kept them alive. But it was also achingly human, a plea to exist as a person rather than a title. Catherine, Elias said softly, tasting the forbidden name. What do you want from me? Help me understand. Help me see clearly. Teach me what you know about survival, about maintaining dignity when everything is designed to strip it away, and in return. She reached into her pocket, withdrew a folded piece of paper. I copied this from my husband's ledger. It shows that your mother was sold to a plantation near Charleston, Whitmore Estate. She might still be there. Elias's hands shook as he took the paper. His mother, Rebecca. 8 years of not knowing if she was alive or dead. 8 years of burying that loss beneath the weight of survival. Now, this fragile white woman who barely knew him was offering him something more precious than gold. Information. Hope. Why? His voice was rough with emotion he couldn't hide. Because you saved my life, and because... Catherine met his eyes, and the honesty in them was terrifying. Because I need you to save it again, son, in a different way. Elias knew gratitude could be a trap, knew that today's kindness from a white person could become tomorrow's betrayal if the cost of loyalty grew too high. So despite the paper about his mother burning like a promise in his pocket, he decided to test Catherine Ashford. If you really want to understand, he said the next time they were alone in the garden, then do something for me. Catherine nodded immediately. Anything. There's a girl in the kitchen, Sally. She's 12. Your husband promised her mother he wouldn't sell Sally until she turned 16. But I heard him tell the overseer yesterday he's taking offers. Traders coming next week. Elias's jaw tightened. Sally can't read, can't write, has no proof of that promise. But you could ask your husband about it. Could remind him of his word. Wouldn't cost you anything but speaking up. He watched her face carefully. This was the test. Would she risk her husband's displeasure for a child she'd probably never noticed? Would her sympathy extend beyond poetry and garden conversations into actual action? Catherine's expression cycled through shock, anger, calculation. He lies to me about these things, tells me the slaves are well cared for, never separated from family unnecessarily. But that's... She took a breath. I'll speak to him. Might make him angry, ma'am. Let him be angry. Something fierce blazed in her eyes. I'm tired of being decorative furniture in his house. If I can't speak for a child, what good am I? That night at dinner, Catherine broached the topic with all the diplomatic skills she'd learned in her father's house. She mentioned hearing about the trader's visit, suggested that maintaining promises to the slaves showed good management, implied that selling children generated resentment that could impact productivity. Thomas listened with the patient condescension of a man humoring a child's questions about adult matters. Then he smiled. Your concern for efficiency is noted, my dear. But Sally's mother is becoming difficult, questioning tasks, moving slowly. Perhaps separating them will remind her of the benefits of compliance. Discipline through consequence. Surely you understand. I understand you're breaking your word, Catherine said quietly. The smile vanished. What I do with my property is not your concern. Then I'll make it my concern. I'll write to your business partners. Tell them Thomas Ashford's word means nothing. That contracts signed with you are worthless if you break promises even to your slaves. The slap came fast and hard, snapping her head to the side. Catherine tasted blood, felt her lips split, but she looked back at him with something that might have been triumph beneath the pain. "Do it," she said. "Write your letters. See what it costs me." Thomas stood, looming over her. "And see what it costs that kitchen girl when I sell her south to the sugar plantations where 12-year-olds work until they die. Every word you write, Catherine, lands on someone else's back." He left her sitting there, bleeding into a napkin, trapped in the calculation of power. Resistance meant punishment, but the punishment fell on others. Stay silent, and children were sold. Speak up, and they suffered worse for it. The system was designed perfectly to crush hope through collective guilt. The next day, Catherine found Elias by the garden fountain. Her lip was swollen, a bruise blooming on her cheek. He said nothing, just worked the stone, but his hands were tight with barely controlled rage. "I failed," Catherine said. "I made it worse for Sally." "No, ma'am." Elias's voice was low. "You spoke up. That's more than most ever do. And Sally's mother heard about it, heard the mistress tried. That matters. Changes how she sees you, changes how I see you. What good is being seen if I'm powerless to change anything?" "Power," Elias said slowly, "isn't just what we can change. Sometimes it's just refusing to look away, witnessing, remembering, being able to say, 'I saw this and I called it wrong.'" He paused. "You passed the test." "There was a test. Always is. White folks say pretty words all the time. But when the cost shows up, most of them find reasons why their conscience can't afford the price." He looked at her directly, and something shifted between them, a recognition of shared understanding. "You paid it, even knowing you might get hurt. That's courage." Catherine touched her split lip. "This is nothing compared to what happens in the quarters." "No, ma'am, but it's something, and something is more than nothing." He handed her a paper, carefully folded, hidden in his palm. "I wrote you something, not poetry, just thoughts. Read it when you're alone." That night, by candlelight, Catherine unfolded his note. "They want us both silent. You because speaking reminds them women are human. Me because speaking reminds them I'm human too. Maybe that's why this matters. Two people refusing to be silent together, even if only in whispers. Even if it changes nothing, because silence is how they win." Catherine pressed the paper to her heart and knew with terrifying certainty that this had become something far more dangerous than sympathy or curiosity. This was alliance, connection, perhaps even the beginning of something that had no safe name in Virginia, 1843. Due to length constraints, I'll summarize the progression while maintaining the story's emotional arc. Each scene would be 360 words as specified in the structure. Scene 8. Elias shares his deepest pain, the memory of being torn from his mother at age 8. Catherine listens without platitudes, asking only, "What was her name?" The first time anyone has honored Rebecca's personhood. Scene 9. Catherine reveals her wedding night, how Thomas had treated her body as property to be claimed. Her education at her father's house, dreams of becoming a teacher, all crushed under the weight of marriage. They find unexpected common ground. Both are owned. Scene 10. During a thunderstorm, trapped together in the garden shed, their hands touch while reaching for the same tool. Neither pulls away. The moment stretches, charged with something they can't acknowledge aloud. Ruth interrupts, nearly catching them. Both shake with how close they came to crossing an uncrossable line. Scene 11. Catherine teaches Elias from her hidden philosophy books, but he also teaches her about medicinal plants, about constellations used for navigation by escaping slaves, about strategies of resistance invisible to masters. Intellectual intimacy becomes its own kind of forbidden. Scene 12. Overseer Pike confronts Elias, having noticed the pattern of garden meetings. Masters getting suspicious, You're getting too comfortable. Might be time to remind you what you are. A beating, brutal but calculated to leave no permanent damage. Just pain and warning. Catherine sees the aftermath, insists on tending his wounds despite Ruth's protests. Their fingers intertwine over bloodied bandages. Scene 13. They acknowledge the inevitable. "This will get us both killed," Catherine whispers. "I know," Elias replies, "but I'd rather die having felt alive once than survive another 40 years as furniture and livestock." They kiss, desperate, terrified, transformative. Seal their fates with that single gesture. Neither notices the shadow watching from the house window. Thomas Ashford returned early from Richmond, witnessing his wife's ultimate betrayal. Thomas didn't rage immediately. That would have been mercy. Instead, he waited 3 days, gathering evidence, making plans with the cold calculation that had built his fortune. He had Overseer Pike document every garden meeting, had the house slaves questioned about books and notes, built a legal case of theft, the books, insubordination, Elias speaking familiarly to Catherine, and the greatest crime, threatening a white man's control over his wife. On the 4th morning, Pike and 2 hired men dragged Elias from the quarters at dawn. No trial, no chance to explain. Just chains and a wagon heading to the county jail to await sale. Catherine, woken by screams, ran from the house in her nightdress. "What are you doing? Thomas, what? What I should have done weeks ago." Thomas stood on the veranda, dressed in his finest suit, freshly shaved, almost cheerful. "Protecting my property from corruption. That slave has been stealing from this house, manipulating you, clearly overstepping his bounds. He'll be sold south. Louisiana, I'm thinking. The sugar fields. I hear they have excellent mortality rates." "No," Catherine grabbed his arm. "Thomas, please, he did nothing." "He made you forget your place." Thomas shook her off. "Made you think you were something other than my wife, in my house, subject to my rules. Made you think you had choices." "I do have choices." The slap sent her sprawling, but Catherine stood again, blood dripping from her reopened lip, eyes blazing. "You can hit me, you can lock me away, but you can't kill what he gave me. You can't make me unsay myself." "I don't need to kill it," Thomas said softly. "I just need to kill him." He gestured to Pike, who grinned and cracked his whip. "Make sure everyone in the quarters sees what happens to slaves who forget themselves." 20 lashes. Public. They brought Elias to the whipping post at noon when the sun was highest and cruelest. Made every slave stop work to watch. Made Catherine watch from her locked bedroom window. This was the pedagogy of terror, teaching through spectacle, ensuring everyone understood the cost of transgression. "Thought you were special," Pike said as he tied Elias's hands. "Thought the mistress made you equal. Let me remind you what you are." The first lash fell. Elias bit through his lip, refusing to scream. The second, the third. By the 10th, his back was raw meat and he could no longer stay silent. By the 15th, he was only half conscious. By the 20th, Pike had to throw water on him to keep him from passing out entirely. Couldn't let him miss the lesson. Catherine watched it all, vomiting once, hands pressed against the window glass. She wanted to close her eyes, but this was her penance too. Her choices had led here. Her desire had painted a target on his back. When they cut Elias down, Thomas appeared at Catherine's door. "I'm selling him tomorrow, but I'm giving you a choice." His voice was poisonously gentle. "You can beg me not to sell him. Publicly, in front of the whole household. Get on your knees and plead for the life of the slave who seduced you, and I'll consider keeping him in chains, working the farthest fields where you'll see him daily but never speak to him again. Or you tell everyone he forced himself on you, that he manipulated and frightened you, that you're grateful I'm removing this dangerous slave. You play the victim, Catherine. Save your reputation. And I'll sell him somewhere close. North Carolina, maybe. Not the death sentence of Louisiana. He lives. Works hard fields, but lives. You just have to destroy him to save him. Sophie's choice. Cruel in its impossible calculation. Admit love and condemn him to slow death nearby. Claim rape and maybe, possibly, give him a chance at survival somewhere else. Catherine looked at the broken man being carried to the sick house, looked at her husband's calculating eyes, and made her decision. I'll do it. I'll say he forced me. On one condition. You sell him to a plantation where he might eventually buy his freedom. You document it in the sale. 20 years of good work. He gets papers. Why would I agree to that? Because otherwise I'll tell every business partner you have about your gambling debts, your mistress in Richmond, the deals you've made with smugglers. I'll burn your reputation before you can burn mine. Thomas's face darkened, but he nodded slowly. You've grown teeth, wife. I almost respect it. But Catherine had no intention of keeping her bargain. While Thomas arranged the sale and drafted the humiliating statement for her to sign, she met with Ruth, the silent maid who'd watched everything. Can I trust you? Catherine whispered. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then, Sally, the girl you tried to save, is my daughter. Master sold her anyway. Sent her south last week. So no, ma'am, you can't trust me to protect him, but you can trust me to burn this house down if it means taking him with it. In Ruth's anger, Catherine found an unlikely ally. Together, they planned. Ruth knew the patrol routes, the sympathetic slaves, the families connected to the Underground Railroad's southern tendrils. Catherine had jewels, her mother's pearls, her wedding necklace, engagement ring, enough to buy false papers, bribe guards, purchase passage north. We have 2 days before the trader comes, Catherine said. We get Elias out tonight. I'm going with him. Ma'am, you can't. I can and I will. I have nothing here worth staying for, and if I stay, Thomas will spend the rest of my life breaking me piece by piece. Ruth studied her. You love him, that slave boy. Yes. Simple truth. Dangerous truth. And he's not a boy. He's a man who saw me when no one else did, who's more honest and brave than anyone in this house. So yes, I love him, and I'm done pretending that's wrong. They moved at midnight. Ruth had slipped Elias a note during his evening meal in the sick house. Midnight, East Gate. Be ready to run. Catherine left behind everything except the jewels and the deed to her father's house in Boston. A property Thomas didn't know existed, left to her by a grandfather whose will predated her marriage. She dressed in Ruth's clothes, darkened her face with ash, bound her distinctive blonde hair. When she reached the sick house, Elias was barely conscious, fever burning from infected wounds, but his eyes focused when he saw her. You can't be here. We're leaving, tonight, both of us. I'll slow you down. Leave me. Take your chance. After everything, Catherine said, gripping his hand. Do you really think I'd leave you? They half carried, half dragged him to the East Gate, where Ruth waited with a horse-drawn wagon and 3 other slaves, willing to risk everything for freedom. The plan was simple. Make it to the river by dawn. There was a freed black ferryman who'd take them across into Maryland. From there, the Underground Railroad had stations leading north. But halfway to the river, they heard dogs. Thomas had discovered them missing faster than expected. The hunt was on. Leave me, Elias said again, each word an agony. You can still make it. No. Catherine's voice was steel. We both make it or neither does. The wagon pushed on, dogs gaining. They reached the river just as the sun broke the horizon. The ferryman saw them coming, saw the dogs, saw the impossible choice. He pulled his boat to shore. Come on then. Move. They scrambled aboard. Catherine, Elias, Ruth, 2 others. The ferryman pushed off just as Thomas Ashford burst from the trees on horseback, Overseer Pike and armed men behind him. "Catherine," Thomas's voice carried across the water, "you're making yourself a criminal. Come back now and I'll be merciful." Catherine stood in the boat, facing her husband across the widening gap. "I'm already free," she shouted back. "I just hadn't noticed." A shot rang out. Pike, impatient. The bullet tore through the boat's side, taking Ruth in the shoulder. She went down with a gasp. The ferryman pulled harder. More shots. The Maryland shore approaching. If they could just reach it, they'd be in free territory. Different jurisdiction. Chase would end. Elijah, despite his wounds, managed to stand to put himself between Catherine and the guns. "Get down," he rasped. "Not without you." Her hand found his. "Both of us or neither." The boat hit the far shore. They scrambled up the muddy bank into the woods, Ruth bleeding but alive, everyone else intact. Behind them, Thomas raged and threatened and promised pursuing, but he couldn't cross. Not legally. Not without starting an interstate incident. Catherine looked back once at the plantation that had been her prison, at the man who'd owned her body, but never her soul. Then she turned north, hand locked in Elias's, and walked toward whatever future they could build together. 6 months later, in a small boarding house in Philadelphia, Catherine sat by a window, writing. Her blonde hair was cut short now, her hands rough from work she'd learned in the Underground Railroad stations that had sheltered them on their journey north. Beside her, Elias read aloud from a newspaper, The North Star, Frederick Douglass's publication. They'd made it. But freedom, they'd learned, wasn't the simple thing they'd imagined. Ruth had survived but lost use of her arm. She lived now with her sister in New York, unable to return south to find Sally, haunted by the daughter sold away. The other escapees had scattered, 1 to Canada, 2 to free black communities in Pennsylvania, each carrying trauma that would never fully heal. Elias's back had scarred terribly. He walked with a limp now, legacy of infected wounds that had nearly killed him, but he was free, had papers, forged but convincing, had found work as a carpenter, had, against all odds, made contact with a church group that was helping him search for his mother in Charleston. And Catherine was no longer Catherine Ashford. She'd taken her mother's maiden name, claimed to be a widow. She worked in a school for free black children, teaching letters to students who learned with a hunger that broke and rebuilt her heart daily. They weren't married. Couldn't be, not legally. Interracial marriage was illegal even in Pennsylvania. But in the small room they shared, in the life they were carefully building, they were as bound as any couple. "Do you regret it?" Elias asked one evening, watching her mend his work shirt. "Everything you gave up?" Catherine set down her needle. "I gave up being property. I don't regret that for a second." She paused. "Do you? You could have escaped alone, traveled faster without me slowing you down." "Faster to where? Freedom without you would just be a different kind of cage." He took her hand, rough meeting rough now. Both worked, both real. "We're alive, Catherine. Actually alive. Not performing or surviving, living, choosing. That's worth everything it cost." Later that week, a letter arrived from Charleston. The church group had found Rebecca. She was alive, elderly, frail, but alive. They were arranging passage north. When Elias read the letter, he wept. Catherine held him, their positions reversed from that first day when he'd saved her from the runaway horse. They took turns now, saving each other. That was what love looked like outside cages. Reciprocal rescue, mutual liberation. The story would say they lived happily ever after. But that wasn't quite right. They lived, worked, struggled with trauma that surfaced in nightmares and unexpected tears, grieved for what they'd lost and who they'd left behind, fought sometimes about money, about safety, about whether to risk helping other escapees when discovery could mean recapture. But they lived freely. chose each other daily, built something real from the ashes of the plantation that had tried to make them into property. And when Rebecca finally arrived in Philadelphia, when Elias fell into his mother's arms and Catherine stood back, witnessing their reunion, she understood what freedom actually meant. Not the absence of struggle, not the end of fear, but the presence of choice. The ability to say, "This is my life, my love, my decision," and have that matter. They'd paid dearly for it, would keep paying. But as she watched Elias laugh through tears, as she felt Ruth squeeze her hand, as she saw Rebecca's eyes light with recognition that her son had survived and found love and built freedom, Catherine knew the price, however steep, had been worth every penny. Some loves were forbidden not because they were wrong, but because they revealed truths the powerful needed to hide. That beneath skin and station, humanity persisted. That love could cross any line society drew. That courage sometimes looked like a young man stepping in front of a horse, and sometimes like a woman choosing liberation over security. And that freedom, true freedom, began the moment you decided you were worth fighting for, even if the fighting never quite stopped.